Hey folks, Fernando doing another video for the Modern Survivalist, and in this video I'd like to talk about firearms and kids. What's the right age to get your child started in all of this? This is a question that I've gotten several times, and also because I was just watching a video on Instagram of like a 6-year-old kid shooting like a practical pistol stage with a 45. The video is, I personally didn't think it was that good an idea of that child, that physical capability that he has, and for this moving around with a firearm that's almost as big as he is. The kid somewhat shoots, okay, but you definitely see that he hasn't got the body type, he hasn't grown enough so as to control that firearm safely. So all that kept in mind, let's talk about what would be a good way to go about all of this. You basically have to take into account three things when it comes to firearms and kids. First of all, if there's any legal restriction where you live. These laws change from one state to the other, one country to the other, depending on what is allowed or not. Usually you will have some kind of restriction. Most cases you will have and it depends on where you live, but maybe 12 years old, 14 years old for going hunting with a shotgun, with a rifle, along with an adult. Sure, some states have no limit whatsoever, and you can take a 5-year-old shooting with a pistol or whatever. So it will depend, first of all, on the legal restrictions you actually have. Now, in the states where you don't have any kind of legal restrictions, that's perfectly fine, but I don't think it's a good idea to give a 1-year-old a Glock and go about your life, do whatever. In the cases where you do have, how is it that they come up with these regulations as of, okay, this age is okay, this one is not so much? Well, usually what they use is a group of experts, firearms experts, psychiatrists, teachers, or people that deal with kids, so as to understand the level of maturity that kids have. Firearms experts explaining the different risks of different type of firearms in regards to how a child may use that incorrectly or not. And basically with all of that, mostly it's going to be about maturity and psychiatrists explaining what kind of maturity and understanding of risk a kid has depending on an age. That's usually going to be playing quite a bit of a factor. So once you get by the legal aspect of this, there's also the psychological aspect of how mature your child is. This is something as a parent you will have to determine yourself how mature your kids is. I've known people that started shooting since they were 3, 4 years old, 5 years old, people that never shot a gun until they were already teenagers or touched their first gun as adults. So you have a pretty broad spectrum there. What is the minimal age in which a child is mature enough? That's something you will only be able to comprehend yourself. And it also depends on the kind of activity you're doing or your child is doing with a gun. This video, I think, was filmed in the Philippines. It was like the youngest practical shooter. This little kid, man, I don't think it was that good, especially because at that age, there's no way in which he understood the risk he was involved in while practicing this activity. A kid that is 5 years old, you can take him to the range, start with an air gun, with a 22, and the way you do it right is minimize the risk. Firearms are dangerous. They're no joke. They're not toys. And you can start doing some sports shooting that's safer than other activities. You can maybe get them started with air guns and move to 22 long guns. A long gun is a little bit safer because it's not as easily, a kid with a handgun can easily do, oh, dad, just like this, and hey, look how cool this is, and points at himself. Those are things that could happen. But you basically decide based on the level of maturity you see the kid has. Maybe when he's 6, 7, 8 years old, 9 years old, you start seeing that he responds better to the commands you give them. If he follows orders correctly, that would be a big one to take into account. Personally, I have 3 boys, 3 kids. one going to college, one still wearing diapers. So I have a little bit of experience with children at different levels of maturity that they're displaying. All kids are different. They have different levels of maturity, and there's not one fixed date or one fixed age. But you have to start, seeing how that works out. One of the things I did is explaining to kids, of course, the basic safety rules of firearms. Always treat the gun as if it's loaded all the time. All guns are always loaded. Keep your finger off the trigger guard. Never point the gun at anything you're not willing to destroy. Be certain of your target and what's behind it. These are all things you teach from a very early age. And then you explain to them that you only touch guns if you are with dad. If you see a firearm for whatever reason and you're on your own, go look for an adult. You look for me and tell me, Dad, there's a gun here. And you try that. Like a week later, a few days later, you leave maybe an airsoft or a replica, something safe. You leave it there and you see how that child responds to that. If he does come looking for you as he was, as it was explained to him. These are all things that you start little by little, with a long gun first, minimal risk. One of the things I learned as part of my firearms instructor course I took while still living in Buenos Aires is that with a new shooter, you're very much on top of them all the time. You have to be ready to get control of the situation. New shooters, especially children, they can move, break the angle very easily, put the finger in the trigger guard when they're not supposed to with a loaded gun. These are all things that can happen. There's actually a video of a couple guys going to a range, and one of them just jokingly points the gun at the other guy in the head. And the instructor, fortunately nearby, jumps in there, takes control of the gun and such. Some people shouldn't have any firearms at any age. They're never going to be mature enough. Some people should not have guns at all, ever, because they're not right in the head. I've known people, bipolar people, or people with serious depression, people that just are not capable of having a firearm because it's not going to be safe for them and for others. So it may never be the day in which they are mature enough. Man, that's something that could also be the case. But as a parent, you have to determine if a kid is old enough, mature enough to safely handle a gun. When you move to handguns, very carefully at first, minimizing the movement of the gun. Finally, then you start going with, drawing from a holster, reloading, dry fire a lot until they're comfortable with that, and then at the very end you start going with movements, displacements with a gun. A 6-year-old, going with a 1911, boom, boom, blowing. It was just cringe-worthy and not. There's little kids that shoot well. There's a few clips. There's a 10-year-old little girl that she handles a Glock like a real proper shooter. This video of the 6-year-old really was not it. I think it was in Philippines or something like that. So one of the other things, I don't know of any serious a training school or club where they would have a 6-year-old running and gunning like that. Sure, a 5-6-year-old with an adult just on top of them, very carefully shooting, sure. But just running around with a gun and barely dropping the thing several times. Even there's a point in which he starts shooting single-handed, and the kid has quite a bit of skill. Obviously, a parent is really serious about teaching the kid how to shoot, and he does very well for how young he is. Now, one of the things I notice is when he starts shooting single-handed, his fingers, and guys, anyone that's an instructor there knows this perfectly well, his hand does not close on the grip of the gun. His tiny little hand barely gets this far. So if you cannot complete a grip, you're not having control of the gun. And the little kid shoots one-handed, like, boom, goes like that, and he keeps enough pressure so as to not drop the thing. That's not safe. That would be the first indication of this child is not developed enough so as to safely handle this type of firearm. That's what responsible adults should have done in that case. But you you have these three elements. You have the legal restrictions that you have to know of and follow depending on where you live. You have the psychological aspect of the level of maturity of the child. Is it safe for him to handle a firearm? And finally, you have the physical limitations of the child. If that child is just too small, too tiny, doesn't have big enough hands to handle safely certain firearms, then he just shouldn't be doing it. Man, there's guys out there that will do anything just to get a few views in a video, right? Or look, my 1-year-old shooting his, and sometimes you see some kind of cute scenes, a dad with his little 2-year-old little girl and with a 22 just on top of him, and yeah, press the trigger. That is somewhat, I don't know if it makes a whole lot of sense, but maybe a first experience that a kid enjoys or not, but that is different from running around with a gun. Even there's a moment in which the kid, when he finishes shooting, he just pulls the slide back, and he kind of misses his slide and goes with putting the palm of the hand a bit in front of the muzzle of the gun. Just, not old enough for that kind of activity. Practical pistol is a serious thing, and it's kind of dangerous as well. There's accidents, not going to be saying all the time, but frequently enough, if you've been practicing any of this for any amount of time, you've heard or seen more than one. It's just a reality of the sport and of the activity. It is something that a person should be adult enough, old enough, mature enough to understand the risk being taken. 5-year-old, 6-year-olds, definitely not enough. And the kind of activity a 6-year-old should do with a gun should be very much restricted and very much limited, so as to reduce the chances of accidents as much as possible. A kid displacing, moving around, running around with a gun at that age, I just don't see it happening. Maybe a little bit older, yeah, sure, with proper care and such. There's parents that just try to live through their kids. That's also an unfortunate reality. I mean, I've known of a kid back in the day, many years ago when I was in school. I had a kid in my class. He drives carts, go-karts, or race with those cars, and he was just too young for it, and his father just kept on pressing him. He had a couple of serious accidents. Last one I knew of, very serious. The kid ended up with some serious disabilities. He's going to be living with those his entire life, and that's because his dad tried to live through him. They just want the kid to be the next best champion or whatever, and they just push it to a limit where it's just not safe, and it's just not worth it, because you're really not going to be changing much if you do things more responsibly, taking the time so as to do things properly and not trying to rush things beyond what it's safe to do and the capabilities of the child. Just the way it is. You have some wonderful, very young shooters, but it is something a parent should be very careful about and do things according to the physical, mental limitations of your kid. Folks, I hope you enjoyed this video. Have an awesome day. See you in our next video. Take care.